Earlier this month, Nintendo of Europe updated its website, explaining how it will become compliant with new European Union legislation that will come into force next February, with various stipulations including on ensuring that batteries in consumer electronics can be readily replaced. Now, readily replaced doesn't mean a return to old laptop batteries that could easily be yanked off and put back on. They'll still be internal, and so it's unlikely that superficially the design of any systems that are affected by this will change. However, instead of using glue, presumably they will need to find a different and more resilient design which can accommodate batteries being removed and put back in, and therefore there will be a need for some kind of new Switch 2 model. Now, Nintendo has released subtle mid-gen revisions previously, including most famously the 2019 so-called Red Box Switch, which did have a better battery life but was otherwise unaffected. Since the legislation for these changes was passed in 2023, Nintendo has had plenty of notice of this coming eventuality and presumably decided to stick with the old approach during 2025 when they launched Switch 2, even knowing that they would have to make an adjustment down the line. It must have been a commercial decision to cut every single cost they could to meet their wished for price point at launch and hope that the margins increased and got better as the system aged. But of course, that hasn't been the case, and in fact, they've had to put up the prices. In theory, if you're making a change to the structure of Switch 2 internally, it would make sense for this to be replicated across not just the Switches bound for Europe, but for their entire product line. Most Switch 2s don't go to EU territories, but a sufficiently large number do that it might be more costly to have separate production lines than to simply make the change for their entire line. Therefore, I think it's reasonably likely that Nintendo will end up in time pushing the revised model out worldwide, although perhaps in Japan last, which would make sense given that location has a bespoke internal model and has a separate price hike treatment this year. However, this raises the question of whether broader revisions could take place like in 2019. This seems unlikelier in many respects, as unlike in 2019, we are in a background of rising memory costs and other problems. If Nintendo can redesign their chipset in such a way that makes it cheaper to produce without sacrificing quality, that would be a huge win, but if that were the case, you might imagine that they'd have held off on a price bump for a little bit. One thing to note, though, is that the Mariko revision to the Switch came alongside the Switch Lite, and so while there were existing reasons for changing the internals of the system back then, not least allowing for a longer battery life, it would seem to be something that would make sense accompanying broader changes. On the one hand, you wouldn't imagine that Nintendo would want to be bounced too much from whatever their original schedule for a Switch 2 Lite model might be, but regional legislative changes by regional legislative changes, but then again, they've had the February date to work towards for a very long time, and we are expecting a Switch 2 Lite very likely in 2027 if the precedent of previous consoles is anything to go by, noting that the 3DS and the Switch both had revisions, and of course the Switch Lite came about 2.5 years after the original model launched. If Nintendo were planning to make more substantial tweaks than changing out glue for something more replaceable when they need to address the specific issues brought up by the EU directive, then it would make sense that they need to make some adjustment to their manufacturing lines, and so doing so in conjunction with ramping up to a Switch 2 Lite model could make some sense. Of course, if this happens, this would put the potential Switch 2 Lite release date early into the new year, very early in fact. The EU regulations come into effect on the 18th of February, and while it wouldn't be necessary for a Lite model to release day and date with changes to the base model, as they doubtless would want a bit of time to build up some stock, it would suggest something broadly along those lines. Mariko models started appearing in August, but the Switch Lite released in September, so pretty close. Nevertheless, it would certainly make sense for Nintendo to try to align these changes and to release a console revision in perhaps February, March, or April of 2027, all months I should say, where they have had success before releasing models, with the 3DS, Switch, and Game Boy respectively releasing in those months in prior years, as well as many other consoles and revisions over the past years. There are other reasons to think that we're not too far from a Switch 2 Lite. I've always felt that Winds and Waves is a great incentive for a handheld version of the system to be released, and the push of that title to 2027 seems to me to make it even likelier that there will be a handheld model for the Switch 2 by the time that title drops. Well, that might not be until November, but it's still conceivable that Winds and Waves releases earlier in the year, especially since leaked data once indicated that the title was indeed intended for 2026, and that even a 2026 release would be a 4-year development window, longer than any generational Pokemon title for a long, long time. It should also be noted that the Pokemon Company has quite a history of making announcements in a Pokemon Presents in August, and in particular this year they're going to be likely wanting to have one, given that they will have news to share about Pocopia. It is completely possible, therefore, that they could give some clarification on the release window for a new Pokemon title at this point. Now, Nintendo's 2026 holiday season is shaping up to be relatively low-key, as currently adumbrated, with the Switch Sports Resort game likely to be a big seller in the long term, but not necessarily quite so huge on day one, leaving Zelda Ocarina of Time currently as the biggest high-impact driver of short-term sales. It would certainly make sense for Nintendo to have a big sales-driving title in March of 2027, therefore, to round off the financial year, especially if there is any concern about a second Western holiday with weaker data for Switch 2, irrespective of whether or not this is replicated across other consoles. It's long been assumed that a major 3D Mario title might fill this slot, and this might still happen. A 7-month hype cycle from a potential September Direct reveal to a March release would be longer than the hype window allowed for Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, and Zelda Ocarina of Time after all, but I don't think Nintendo see 3D Mario as the face for their handheld version consoles. In the past, titles like Luigi's Mansion and Animal Crossing have been more closely associated with those. If the next 3D Mario requires a bit more time, it could easily be a holiday or 2028 game, but equally, putting new Pokemon and new Mario too close to each other might be tricky to juggle. I'm skeptical that they would want both in the same holiday season for risk of competing with each other, although if they released one in early October and the other in late November, it would probably work fine, especially since they're massive evergreens anyway, and so any competition from each other would probably be delaying sales rather than replacing them. Irrespective, how would an early 2027 Switch 2 Lite release work? Well, the Zelda movie is coming in late April, so while they'll want to use the movie to raise the salience of their product, I don't think a launch that month would be ideal, as it might just end up confusing their messaging. They also likely wouldn't want to reveal the machine before 2027, as that would impede their 2026 holiday sales, and while they have done very well with early in the year announcements, the second week in January is normally the earliest that they would go to, as this wouldn't oblige their staff to work through Christmas and New Year, something that I'm sure they'd be willing to do if need to be, but I also think that Nintendo do recognise that this might be problematic and unnecessary. Past revisions have had a lead time of around 10 weeks, so 10 weeks would take it to the last Thursday of March, a day when Nintendo do frequently release games, including fairly often significant ones like Animal Crossing New Horizons and Super Mario Bros. Wonder Nintendo Switch 2 Edition. Now, I don't think that they would necessarily want or need a Pokemon at launch. The ownership of Pokemon is a little more involved than other Nintendo properties, and in any event, there's no precedent of launch day Pokemon on previous consoles, and they will want to pace out demand for the system. Therefore, they will need another system-selling game near the beginning of the console's life, but possibly not too heavy a system seller, since they will want to manage the flow of early consoles. The last time they had a launch day title for a handheld, it was Zelda Link's Awakening on the Switch Lite in 2019, and if there's any window that's hugely likely to have a top-down Zelda, it's the window between the announcement of the Zelda 40th festivities and the new movie. Not only would a late March Zelda have a symmetry with the late March Super Mario Bros. Wonder Nintendo Switch 2 Edition released this year, it would also keep the game as separate from Ocarina of Time as possible while still making the same financial year. As to what this game could be, I think if they wanted to replicate the Switch Lite, then there's really only one candidate that would make sense: A Link to the Past, reborn, as they like to say, on the new system. It was always the chunkier cousin of Link's Awakening. It's iconic, it's exactly the kind of title they can sell alongside the film, with Ocarina modelling the utility of the full Switch 2 model, and A Link to the Past showing the appeal of the Lite. Of course, they could probably pull the launch back 3 weeks without too significant an impact. They become quite good at short notice launches after all, and this would allow them to get a second significant title in before the end of the financial year. Not necessarily a brand new title, but perhaps something else that would jibe well with a handheld aesthetic. Tomodachi Life Nintendo Switch 2 Edition, for example. This might be useful just to avoid the sense of having too few sales in the first financial year if there's only a few days for the Switch 2 Lite to sell. This could potentially be embarrassing for Nintendo, and so they will probably want to make sure that they have a little bit more flexibility and don't release right on the final week of the month. Also, while the default assumption I frequently made with Luigi's Mansion 4 is that it would be an October game, especially after Luigi's Mansion 3 broke with Nintendo's usual release date to release on Halloween itself, note that Dark Moon released in March and Luigi's Mansion 2 HD released in June, so it's not completely a lock that the next Luigi's Mansion needs to be an October game. It suited them in 2019 to take advantage of that timing because they'd already had those games in that particular rhythm, but that's not to say that they couldn't do something different with a big Luigi's Mansion title at another point. But why do I mention Luigi's Mansion? Well, their choice to put Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon on 3DS, not Wii U, and to launch Luigi's Mansion 3 mere weeks after the Switch Lite indicates that they see a strong benefit to Luigi on the junior console, the younger brother console, if you will. Now, a lot of water has passed under the bridge since 2019, but nevertheless it would make sense for Nintendo to want to replicate this again, especially when you consider that there are a lot of echoes in the Switch 2 lineup already, both to the original Switch and with the new Star Fox and Ocarina versions to 3DS. Launching Luigi's Mansion in March to end the fiscal year, May to ride the film hype wave, or July to coast into the Japanese spooky season of Obon would all be consistent with this strategy. Until now, I've been cool on the prospects of Luigi's Mansion 4 coming too soon. Key figures from Luigi's Mansion 3 were credited in important roles on Strikers Battle League, and with game development taking longer for 4K gaming, plus, given how successful Luigi's Mansion 3 was on the original Switch, and the fact that Nintendo will want to increase the scope of Luigi's Mansion 4 still further, turning it from the small prestige title of the original Luigi's Mansion into a true AAA is likely to take some time, and so I've been long skeptical about expectations of it arriving in October 2026 or even October 2025. But May, June, July 2027, a 5-year development cycle after the release of Strikers Battle League, well, that starts to feel a lot more plausible, and that slot has other advantages as well. Luigi's Mansion is a far more Western-facing game than many on the company's roster, and the property has an obvious marquee appeal for potential cinematic expansion. By releasing the game alongside the Zelda film, they can surely raise the salience of and attention for the property in Hollywood before finalizing negotiations on a surely inevitable Luigi's Mansion film. At this stage, they would have successfully recreated most aspects of the vastly successful Switch Lite launch, a major Fire Emblem released right before, potentially Mario Maker right before as well, since irrespective of whether it releases this year, I do think that's probably in the warp pipe, then a launch day with a new version of a beloved Zelda classic, followed relatively soon by Luigi's Mansion and Pokemon Wind and Waves. If they could replicate September to November 2019 in March to July 2027, that would be an incredibly robust sales window even without 3D Mario. And of course, the cherry on the top for Switch Lite was the release of Animal Crossing New Horizons at the end of the Switch Lite's first financial year. Unlike with Switch Lite, where I think they needed to announce Animal Crossing early to aid the sales velocity of the system, and they evidently were targeting the Switch Lite launch window, I suspect that they will have enough content to maintain momentum without that long a launch window for Animal Crossing. But then again, the last Animal Crossing was absolutely vast, and Nintendo will need to do a lot more work than most properties to raise the profile of the game to the more casual coded fans, to show them not just that there's a new Animal Crossing coming, but also why people should dive back into it. The film could probably help in that endeavour, and so it might make some sense to do a tease in 2027, even if the game isn't due out until 2028, so that all their advertising can include the Switch Lite. Much in the same way as I think they gave a trailer for Tears of the Kingdom in 2021, particularly so they could use it the next month in the Switch OLED announcement trailer. 3D Mario wouldn't be ruled out by any of this, like Ring Fit Adventure in 2019, a non-Lite title that nevertheless was a huge holiday seller. It can land anywhere and still be a huge thing for Nintendo. But if you assume that Nintendo want to give maximum time to the next Mario, then you can see the relatively early release of a Switch 2 Lite could take a lot of pressure off their whole schedule. Now, all of this relies on there being a sufficiently substantial change to the production of Switch 2, and that's by no means certain. In any event, a more logical pacing might be just to rerun 2019 with Zelda A Link to the Past in September of 2027, Luigi's Mansion in October, Pokemon in November, and then if they could land Animal Crossing in 2028, well, then I think they will really be off to the races. Still, if they brought this whole plan forward, especially if they were concerned about the wait for major AAA titles like Mario, Zelda, and Smash, well, I do think this could absolutely work to tie in to the Zelda movie and to make for a fantastic launch for the Switch 2 Lite, which, after all, is something that they are going to want to try to get out to the market so that they have a lower cost alternative given the current price hikes. In terms of forecasting, therefore, let's start by saying what we can almost certainly confirm to be true and not true, and then work backwards. So my 90%, I think a new Switch model will release by the end of 2028, a top-down Zelda will release by the end of 2029, a new Luigi's Mansion will release by the end of 2030, and Pokemon Winds and Waves will make its 2027 release window. Dicier, but still likely, I'm going to say 70% of top-down Zelda comes before the end of 2027. A Tomodachi Life Nintendo Switch 2 edition comes within 18 months of a Switch 2 Lite releasing. 70% also Luigi's Mansion comes within 18 months of the Switch 2 Lite releasing. 50% a Switch 2 Lite or equivalent releases prior to July 2027. 50% some form of A Link to the Past releases prior to the end of 2028. And 30% a Switch 2 Lite or equivalent releases prior to the Zelda film. I don't necessarily think what I've outlined is going to be plan A, but there are some reasons why I think it could be more plausible, and I like to try to work backwards from potential end results to see if the outline makes sense, and I think in this case, maybe it does. Let me know what you think there in the comments below, and if you'd like to check out the Patreon, please do, as there's early ad-free and exclusive content there to be seen. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.